Since its launch in 2019, SpaceX's Starlink initiative has been gradually creating a global layer of digital connectivity, and the results are nothing short of remarkable. Regions once considered unreachable now enjoy high-speed internet access for the first time, and communities long overlooked have been propelled into the modern digital era. Yet despite the many benefits Starlink has provided, SpaceX has not been immune to criticism. As effective as low Earth orbit satellites are for delivering high-speed internet, they can also be harnessed for far more nefarious purposes, namely warfare. In response to a perceived military threat, Russia and China have even threatened to blow the satellites out of the sky. Nevertheless, SpaceX remains undeterred, and today Starlink stands as the largest satellite network in human history. So, is the Starlink project a giant leap forward for humanity, conquering the digital divide and offering positive benefits, or is it a catalyst for war, posing the biggest threat to political stability in over a century? Well, the project holds the potential for either outcome, and at this point, it's difficult to predict which future the world is headed toward. What is Starlink, and how does it work? On May 25, 2019, stargazers were stunned to witness a train of 60 mysterious lights creeping across the night sky. Many naturally assumed it was aliens, because of course they did, only to learn that the lights were just the work of Elon Musk's company SpaceX. The lights were the first batch of Starlink low Earth orbit satellites launched from Cape Canaveral and were followed by thousands more in the years that followed. But 2019 wasn't the start of the Starlink project. Its origins go back much further than that. You see, in the 1980s, the first mentions of high-speed, low-latency satellites surfaced in connection with a strategic defense initiative known as Brilliant Pebbles, which is a nice name. The idea was that a constellation of weapon-carrying, low Earth orbit satellites could form a defensive net over the United States, intercepting incoming missiles before they hit their target. Although Brilliant Pebbles never advanced beyond the conceptualization phase, engineers noted that a similar system could be utilized for low-latency communication. And not long after, in the 1990s, a series of commercial low Earth orbit satellite constellations was launched, including Celestri, Teledesic, Iridium, and Globalstar. These companies, which were decades ahead of their time, ultimately became casualties of the infamous dot-com bubble collapse. Fast forward to 2002, Elon Musk was founding SpaceX and expressing interest in launching similar low Earth orbit communication projects. However, it wasn't until 2014 that the idea began to gain traction, and by 2016, the company had filed for a license with the Federal Communications Commission. Around the same time, the first generation of Starlink satellites had already entered the design phase. And speaking of Starlink satellites, each is designed to handle high volumes of digital information transfer, as is necessary for internet surfing, while also being voice and text capable via direct-to-cell technology. GPS navigational data is generated from onboard analysis of transmitted signals, making the satellites more or less universal in the world of digital communication. As to how Starlink satellites differ from the thousands of others that have come before, it all comes down to orbital altitude. Starlink satellites operate in low Earth orbit. While they aren't the only satellites at this altitude, with companies including OneWeb, Amazon Kuiper, and Telesat Lightspeed, Starlink remains by far the most prominent. To understand the pros and cons of low Earth orbit, it's useful to compare these satellites with most other communication satellites, specifically those out in geostationary orbit. Geostationary orbit, that refers to satellites positioned at an altitude of about 35,500 kilometers above the Earth's equator. The term geostationary describes an orbital object that remains fixed above a given point on the planet's surface. This positioning ensures that the satellites always maintain a direct, uninterrupted line of sight with their ground-based counterparts, allowing for a steady stream to be sent and received. Because of their high altitude, these satellites cover a vast area of the Earth's surface, making them ideal for broadcasting and telecommunication purposes. The geostationary satellite network is renowned for its reliability, barring any particularly severe weather, and the 563 units currently in orbit handle signal relays for virtually every country on the planet. So, what are the drawbacks of geostationary satellites that necessitate low Earth orbit alternatives? Well, most notably, geostationary satellites are limited in number, with each handling only a finite amount of data, and their high altitudes introduce significant delays. For instance, a one-way trip of information to a satellite at 35,000 kilometers takes around 240 milliseconds, meaning a complete round trip exceeds 500 milliseconds. And that might seem pretty insignificant at first glance, but if you've ever tried playing an online game with a delay of even 100 milliseconds, you know how upsetting it can be. Because of these issues, geostationary satellites are not ideal for managing internet browsing data, which is why they're not typically expected to handle that type of traffic. Instead, most of the world's internet activity is managed by an extensive ground network, including hundreds of transoceanic fiber optic cables that account for roughly 95% of global traffic. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, you won't be able to take advantage of any of these services, whether satellite or ground-based, unless the necessary infrastructure is in place. Internet availability has increased dramatically over the last few decades, particularly in low-income countries, thanks to the propagation of cell phone towers. Even still, around 1/3 of the population is still without reliable access to the internet, a shortfall often referred to as the world's digital divide. This is where Starlink comes in, offering a sweeping solution to all of the above challenges. First, data transfer delays are mitigated by placing satellites in low Earth orbit instead of geostationary positions. Starlink constellations sit at an altitude of just 550 kilometers, which cuts the millisecond delay down to only 50. The satellites are also specifically designed to handle vast amounts of data transfer, with a Starlink constellation offering download speeds between 50 and 250 megabits per second, depending on circumstances. These speeds, of course, they're not the fastest at all, but when considering that this service is available in the middle of the Amazon jungle, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest cell tower, the results are pretty incredible. With all that being said, this type of technological innovation doesn't come without complications, and it's probably already pretty obvious what those complications are. With Starlink constellations orbiting so close to the planet's surface, the number of individual satellites required to offer reliable, uninterrupted service is immense. Dozens or even hundreds of low Earth orbit satellites are needed to cover the same area as a single geostationary alternative, and the logistics and cost of maintaining such a vast network cannot be overstated. SpaceX has already sunk billions into Starlink and its associated technology, with the satellites having undergone multiple generations of advancement. Although costs do vary, estimates put the expense to build and launch a single Starlink satellite at just under $1 million. Considering that each satellite has an expected lifespan of only 5 years, the complexity of the operation becomes even more striking. By comparison, a standard geostationary satellite costs between, wait for it, $100 and $500 million to manufacture and launch, with a large portion of that expense attributed to achieving the required orbital position. A geostationary satellite, on the other hand, is expected to last at least 15 years and serve hundreds of millions, if not billions of users. At this point, we've covered the basics, and it's time to delve into some of the more controversial aspects of Starlink, specifically the intended purpose of the satellites. Although the company is officially described as a commercial internet service provider, as already hinted, the network can also be used for more nefarious applications like warfare. Military hardware or internet service provider. Some argue that the public isn't Starlink's primary customer, but rather, it's the US government. From the very start, the US has had a keen interest in establishing a low Earth orbit communication network, with some even suggesting that Starlink was created to serve the government first and the public second. We cannot confirm whether that's true, but reliable communication is undeniably essential for the US Department of Defense, including the Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, and of course the Marine Corps and Army. Combat drones, which now form a significant part of military arsenals, depend on reliable data transfer. In this context, a network like Starlink could provide an ideal solution. Moreover, a satellite network is considerably more difficult to disrupt than traditional ground infrastructure, giving a military entity supported by Starlink a major strategic advantage. And on that note, let's talk about Starlink's involvement in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When Russian forces launched their offensive on Ukrainian soil in February 2022, local communication infrastructure was deliberately targeted, placing Ukrainian defenders at a significant disadvantage. Just 2 days into the conflict, Chief Commander of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, addressed Musk directly, asking him to turn on Starlink coverage of the region. Musk agreed, and tens of thousands of Starlink routers were shipped across Ukrainian borders and provided to military operatives. The satellite network was secured, and almost immediately the service established itself as a critical backbone of military efforts. However, as the Ukrainian military shifted its use of the communication system from humanitarian efforts to launching counter-offensive missions, SpaceX publicly expressed reservations. In February 2023, SpaceX President Gwynne Shotwell insisted that Starlink remain a civilian network, stressing that the company would not take sides in conflicts. She added that Starlink access had been provided to Ukraine for humanitarian purposes only, and that the satellites were never meant to be used as weapons of war. She concluded that steps had been taken to limit how the Ukrainian military could use the network in regard to drones, though she didn't elaborate on what limitations were being enforced. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolak tweeted that companies have to choose which side they're on, and that SpaceX could either join Ukraine in its fight for freedom or side with Russia and support their efforts to kill and seize territories. Musk responded to that, saying, "SpaceX Starlink has become the connectivity backbone of Ukraine, extending all the way to the front lines. This is the damned if you do part. However, we are not allowing Starlink to be used for long-range drone strikes. This is the damned if you don't part." In response to this challenge, the US Department of Defense, SpaceX, and the Ukrainian military negotiated a compromise. They established a new entity called Starshield, which utilizes Starlink satellites but is not officially a part of Starlink or SpaceX. To facilitate this separation, SpaceX upgraded its Starlink satellites with encryption and anti-jamming technology, ensuring that they meet military communication standards. These enhanced satellites were then either leased or outright sold to the DoD, which employs them for military purposes. This arrangement effectively distances SpaceX from direct military involvement while allowing Starlink to continue operating as a civilian internet service provider. Now, at the time Starshield was publicly announced, Musk is quoted as saying, "Starlink needs to be a civilian network, not a participant to combat. Starshield will be owned by the US government and controlled by DoD Space Force. This is the right order of things." At the same time, Musk was clearly distancing himself and his company from any military applications of its hardware. Officially, Starlink's only role in the conflict is to provide services to the Ukrainian public. How well this distraction holds up in practice is debatable, though SpaceX has repeatedly insisted that Starlink is not a tool for warfare. Either way, the Ukrainian military remains fully reliant on the satellites to this day. It is confirmed that they've used them to coordinate artillery strikes on Russian targets and to connect combat and naval drones. SpaceX is regarded as a reliable ally of the Ukrainian military, with the only other major point of conflict arising from a request to extend Starlink coverage into Russian-occupied Crimea. The intention behind the proposed extension was to aid in a Ukrainian counteroffensive, though it would have, by extension, also provided satellite coverage to Russian troops. SpaceX refused the request, stating that doing so would violate US-imposed sanctions on Russia. And speaking of Russia, the Kremlin has been heavily critical of SpaceX's involvement in the conflict, even warning that the satellites may soon become military targets. This sentiment was echoed by the head of Russia's space agency, Dmitry Rogozhin, who referred to SpaceX's claims that Starlink is for civilian use only as fairy tales. Rogozhin said in regards to Starlink, quote, "Muskophiles say this is amazing. It is the light of our worldwide cosmic exploration." Well, Musk has taken a side. I don't have issues with him. It's obvious it's the West, which we should never trust, because it has always been chronically plagued by jealousy among its political elites toward our country. Just look at how they are currently racing to defecate on our relationships and who is going to clean up the mess later. What is happening right now is very dangerous, and Musk replied to that saying, "Ukraine's civilian internet was experiencing strange outages. Bad weather perhaps? So SpaceX is helping fix it." Meanwhile, it isn't only Russia that has expressed concern about the satellites. In May 2022, China made a similar threat. An official announcement declared that the Chinese military had drawn up a peer-reviewed strategy to destroy Starlink satellites should they ever pose a threat to national security. Looking at the situation from a different angle, and it's clear the satellite network was always intended to accommodate the US DoD, though not necessarily for warfare. Years before the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, back in 2019, the United States Air Force Research Laboratory announced that it had successfully demonstrated Starlink data transfer with a Beechcraft C-12 Huron and an AC-130 gunship. Soon after, the US Air Force confirmed that the satellites were suitable to support their advanced battlefield management system. In October 2022, SpaceX was awarded a $150 million contract by the Space Development Agency aimed at developing a satellite network to form a tracking layer for ballistic and hypersonic missiles. The first Starshield contract was issued in September 2023, focusing on customized satellite communication services for the US Navy, Army, Air Force, and Coast Guard. Although contracts were broadly offered at the time with an emphasis on a low Earth orbit communication network, ultimately only one contract was approved, and it went to Starshield. As it stands, the Russia-Ukrainian conflict is the most widely debated and well-known aspect of the Starlink controversy, but unfortunately, it's only the tip of the iceberg. The company has also been accused of providing communication networks to multiple criminal empires and terrorist groups. In addition, there's another angle to these satellites that we haven't yet emphasized. They are particularly useful for bypassing local regulations and evading law enforcement agencies. The other controversies. Alright, let's make something clear. Governments actively regulate and monitor communication networks for good reason. Law enforcement relies on the ability to track communications between criminals, and government organizations are able to do so based on agreements with local service providers. If criminal organizations were to get their hands on a means of communication that bypassed local infrastructure, and by extension government regulations, their communications would effectively be beyond the reach of the law. Such is the case in the Sahel and the Islamic West African province, where smuggling and exploitation of Starlink receivers has become routine. A smuggling network sprung up almost overnight when services first became available in neighboring Nigeria. Once registered Nigerian subscribers began receiving shipments, criminal entities quickly realized the value of the units and started accumulating as many as possible for the black market. It's estimated that existing criminal networks have smuggled thousands of units. The situation has reportedly worsened dramatically due to the new and largely misunderstood nature of the technology, leaving border checkpoints completely unaware of what they are supposed to restrict. Realizing what was happening, Niger and Chad quickly licensed Starlink and placed it under government oversight, hoping not only to strip power from smugglers but also to force Starlink to comply with state demands. The effort represented a step in the right direction, although it came far too late, with estimates suggesting that tens of thousands of illegal receivers had already crossed the borders. Now, at this point, if you were thinking that Starlink could simply deactivate unregistered units to instantly solve the problem, that's not how things work. According to Starlink, there is no method to distinguish between receivers that are legally registered and those that aren't. The only option available is to restrict access for entire geographical regions. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Starlink has been publicly clashing with the government, with tensions reaching a fever pitch in 2024. The local telecommunication regulator, Anatel, expressed concerns over X, formerly Twitter, being used as a means to spread hate and misinformation regarding Brazilian democracy. In response to these concerns, sanctions were imposed and Starlink's accounts were frozen, accompanied by a demand to block access to X within the country. Although Starlink initially refused to comply, resulting in X being banned, an agreement was later negotiated that allowed X to resume services, while Starlink was subsequently greenlit. As part of this agreement, Starlink has agreed to help the Brazilian government curb criminal activity in the Amazon region. Local users in the Amazon are now required to provide identification and proof of residence before they can access the satellites. In 2022 in Iran, after the government blocked internet access to suppress anti-government protests, Musk quickly announced that Starlink would be made available in the region. In doing so, he underscored that with its roaming features, Iranian locals could bypass government censorship and regain access to uncensored news networks. The Iranian government responded by banning the receivers. However, reports indicate that thousands of units had already been smuggled into the country, with many more continuing to cross the border today. The last controversy that we're going to touch on concerns the reported risk posed by the increasing number of Starlink satellites in orbit. Global space agencies fear a phenomenon known as Kessler syndrome, a situation where objects in low Earth orbit exceed a critical threshold, begin to collide, and create an ever denser field of debris. Should this scenario occur, leaving our atmosphere would become increasingly hazardous, potentially hampering future space exploration efforts before they've even begun. In response, Starlink explained that its satellites are designed to deorbit automatically once they've completed their lifespan. This process removes them from low Earth orbit and prevents an excessive buildup of atmospheric debris. Despite this measure, various space agencies continue to express concern. In 2021, China lodged a complaint with the United Nations stating that the Tiangong space station had been forced to employ evasive maneuvers to avoid Starlink satellites in July and October of that year. Chinese authorities stressed that the satellites pose a serious collision hazard and are putting the lives of Chinese astronauts at risk. In February 2022, a similar formal letter was sent to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration on behalf of NASA and the National Science Foundation. The letter warned that operating in low Earth orbit is becoming increasingly dangerous and that the potential for collisions would soon begin impacting rocket launches and other space missions. Meanwhile, SpaceX maintained that Starlink satellites are self-monitoring and capable of utilizing their own collision detection technology. According to the information provided, a Starlink satellite will automatically initiate an avoidance maneuver if the probability of collision is detected to be 1 in a million, dramatically exceeding the industry standard of 1 in 10,000. The company also stressed that each satellite carries enough onboard propellant for 5,000 propulsive actions over its lifetime, which could allow for around 350 potential collision avoidance maneuvers. In that regard, SpaceX is required to file reports with the Federal Communications Commission. In the report covering the period from December 1st, 2023 to May 31st, 2024, it was revealed that the company's satellites performed around 50,000 collision avoidance maneuvers, approximately 14 per satellite. As of July 2025, there has not been a collision between a Starlink satellite and any other astral body. However, it remains to be seen how the situation will evolve as more satellites are added to the network. The many blessings. Now, at this point, we've placed a considerable emphasis on the controversies surrounding SpaceX and Starlink. These issues certainly deserve the attention that they are receiving. However, it's also important to acknowledge the positive contributions of the company's satellites. Despite their undeniable benefits, these contributions tend to receive very little, if any, media attention. True to Elon Musk's word, Starlink has focused on bringing internet access to underserved areas, with special attention paid to rural regions in Africa and South America. These areas have little to no publicly available infrastructure, yet that obstacle has been entirely bypassed. Users only need an A4-size satellite receiver, a few minutes of setup, and an internet-capable device. Service packages remain very affordable, particularly in the northern parts of Africa, where 5 of the 16 regions report Starlink pricing that is cheaper than offerings from local service providers. Meanwhile, closer to home in the United States, rural schools are also benefiting. The Navajo Nation community in New Mexico, which has gone without reliable internet access for decades, has secured a Starlink contract. As a result, the community, including the Owo Encino preschool, now enjoy internet access on par with the rest of the country. A similar approach has proved beneficial for the rural community of Mist, Oregon, where the Veronia School District had previously been told that laying reliable communication infrastructure would be too expensive. Superintendent for the Veronia School District, Aaron Miller, said, quote, "This school went from slow, ineffective connectivity for even 2 to 3 computer stations to having high-speed internet where all 36 of our children can have effective internet connectivity simultaneously. It has been a class-changing event for our teachers and students." Starlink services are also benefiting students in Chile through a partnership with Enseña Chile, an organization dedicated to quality education. Escuela Básica Manuel de Salas, an elementary school in the remote fishing community of Guanacaras, now enjoys online connectivity comparable to that of any urban education facility. Additionally, Starlink has committed to a $27 million agreement in South Africa to provide free internet services to schools in remote communities, benefiting around 2.4 million students. This deal is part of an equity equivalent investment program and circumvents a required mandate by the local regulator, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. Previously, the regulator had refused to grant Starlink a license because telecommunications services were required to be at least 30% locally owned. By investing in local communities, Starlink will now be able to obtain a license to operate legally in the country. Whatever your opinion of SpaceX and the divisive Elon Musk, Starlink isn't going anywhere. Its network is expected to increase exponentially in the coming years. The constellation currently consists of over 7,600 mass-produced satellites, making up a total of 65% of all man-made objects in Earth's atmosphere. Plans are for the number to increase to 12,000, with a stated possibility that the total may even rise to 34,000. As far as subscribers are concerned, current estimates indicate that 6 million users have signed up across 140 territories. This number is expected to grow as more satellites are added to the network, additional ground structure is finalized, and more countries grant operating licenses. Whether the Starlink project is overall positive is up for debate, and however you feel about Elon Musk, your own opinion is valid. One thing we can all agree on is that Starlink is dramatically reducing the digital divide, and that is a tech revolution everyone can get behind. Thank you for watching.